It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, Episode 84. Hello, and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling between 1870 and 1930. And in this episode, I will be discussing a closed-door match between Fred Beell and Tom Jenkins, as well as reviewing the Iron Claw film about the Von Erich family. But first, I'm recording this podcast on Sunday, April 6th, 2025. And yesterday, Saturday, April 5th, I gave a presentation called What Are Yeggmen? Yeggmen, the intersection of building history and true crime at the Eugene Fieldhouse and Toy Museum here in St. Louis, Missouri. I have always been a aficionado of St. Louis history in my hometown. One of the cases that I've researched in the past involved an arrest at the Eugene Fieldhouse before it was the Eugene Fieldhouse and Museum. Eugene Field, the famous American poet, was born in that area in 1850, and he lived in the house from 1850 to 1856. His father, Roswell Field, owned the house from 1850 to 1865. And then Eugene Field went on to be one of the more famous American poets. And so this museum preserves the house that he lived in, as well as it is a toy museum. Eugene Field's mother died when he was very young, so he was sent to live with his aunt when he was about 6 years old. That's why he was only here for the 6 years. But the Eugene Field House is one of the great testaments to preservation efforts in St. Louis, Missouri. The effort to start preserving that began in 1936, and they have a very strong association to this day maintaining the facilities there. And one of the things that the museum offers is author talks, and I was honored to be invited to give the talk. I'm not sure if they're going to post a link because it was on Zoom. So we had a torrential downpour yesterday. 20 people signed up for the talk, but only 4 people ended up coming to the museum. You have to register. They transfer their registration from in person to Zoom. So the majority of people saw it on Zoom. If the Eugene Fieldhouse puts up a link for that talk, I will put it in the show notes in one of the future episodes. But it was a real honor, even though it's not combat sports history related. I was still honored to be invited and to give the talk. Also, this week on Friday, April 4th, the podcast, A Geek History of Time, invited me onto their show to talk about one of the books I wrote a few years ago in 2021, Double Crossing the Goldust Trio. And it's about the events leading up to Stanislaus Zbyszko double crossing Big Wayne Munn in Philadelphia in April of 1925 and legitimately taking the title from him and taking it away from the Goldust Trio, in effect. The podcast we recorded in January, both Damien and Ed, so Damien Harmony and Ed Blaylock are the co-hosts of A Geek History of Time, and they talk about a number of different topics in geek culture or history that really interest them. And I really had a great time. It was 10:30 my time, 8:30 their time. And because I get up at 4 o'clock to go to the gym, I was a little tired that morning. And I was actually Saturday, I teach TKD in the morning and then go to the gym. But within 5 to 10 minutes of talking to Damien and Ed, I was energized. I thought we had a good rapport, and I really enjoyed being on the podcast with them. And I've since become a regular listener of their shows. So I wanted to share that the episode that I'm on is episode 310, and there'll be a part 2 that comes out next Friday on April 11th, which will be part 2 of the discussion. There's a couple others that I would also recommend for wrestling fans. Damien Harmony, who was a wrestling fan in San Francisco. He did a series called The Fall of the Hitman and the Rise of the Rattlesnake about when Brett was on the descend in WWE and the Stone Cold Steve Austin was ascending in World Wrestling Entertainment. Well, it was WWF back then. So when the Hitman was kind of heading out the door because him and Shawn Michaels couldn't get along, and the Rattlesnake was on the ascendancy, he did an actual 8-part series on that, which was outstanding. If you're a fan of the Monday Night Wars and all that was going on back then, I highly recommend that. But I also want to recommend 2 others, and these are fairly recent, so they'll be easy to find. The second one was a series that Ed Blaylock did, and I have watched Age of Samurai, the documentary on Netflix, and I have read a bunch of books on this time period in Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate, because being a martial artist, you hear about it, and I was very interested in it. And I thought Ed did one of the absolute best reviews of this time period in Japanese history. And the name of this series is Shogun, Way Back Then, and Now. And he also talks about the movies that have been made of the book, I think that James Clavell wrote. I think that's his name. I highly recommend Shogun, Way Back Then, and Now. And then the last one is one that Damien just did recently, and on the Netflix series Watership Down, but of course he brings in a whole bunch of other things as well, historically related. The first one is a War and Peace Watership Down Part 1, and it goes for 3 parts. So I would recommend all of those. Give their show a listen, and they've got a very well developed archive. You can see my episode was episode 310. So, and Damien and Ed, I just want to thank you. Great time, and I love listening to your show. So, the main content of this episode, when I was going to do it with Caleb, was going to be the review of Iron Claw, the movie about the Von Erich family. I do still want to go pretty deeply into that, but I know most people tune in to listen to me talk about history back in the time period that we advertised this show for. So I wanted to talk about a closed door match that occurred between Tom Jenkins and Fred Beell. And this match occurred when Tom Jenkins was the American Heavyweight Wrestling Champion. Tom Jenkins is one of the few wrestlers I can say that I have never seen a wrestling match that I think he worked. If I was tempted to think that he worked a match, I might have thought it was this match just because of the kind of quirky outcome for a second. But I think it was more of a Tom Jenkins not taking Beell as seriously as he should, and then him waking up and taking care of business. And you'll see what I'm talking about in just a minute. But Fred Beell had been campaigning for a match with Jenkins for months. So this is during a time where Jenkins took the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship from Gotch, and then Gotch would take it back from him. Fred Beell was an extremely talented but small heavyweight wrestler. And that was always his biggest weakness. Beell was very powerfully built. He had a bodybuilder's physique in a time when that really wasn't normal. But Beell also only stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, and he weighed 165 pounds. Muscular 165 pounds, but he only weighed 165 pounds. Jenkins was similarly muscled, but Jenkins stood 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed 210 pounds. Beell had wanted to get a match with Jenkins because he thought it would be a big payday, obviously wrestling the American Heavyweight Wrestling Champion. And in 1905, he finally gets Jenkins to wrestle a match with him But instead of a match in an arena, which Beell was expecting, the men wrestled in a New York City gymnasium. They invited 100 VIPs and sporting men to watch the private match. So they got a little bit of a gate, but not very much at all. And the bout was 2 out of 3 falls for $1,000 a side. So really what they're wrestling for is the $500 that each of them put up. I'm sorry, $1,000. They didn't put up 500, they put up 1,000. A lot of times both would put up 5 and they'd have a $1,000 purse, but this one was a $1,000 a side, so the purse was $2,000. Beell, unlike Jenkins, did take part in worked matches, but he also wrestled contests. And the men were not going to wrestle in a ring, which was not unusual. Most matches took place on mats, not in rings during this time. They were wrestling on a mat, and the mat was abutted up against the wall of the private gymnasium. After 2 hours of wrestling, which was probably as boring as watching paint dry, when people wonder why wrestling became a work, it was because to make it more exciting so people would be interested in watching it. Contests can be so boring because people are stalemated and they just stay in the same position for a long time. They're not in a rest hold. They're looking for an advantage. They're feeling for the person to make a mistake or to give a little bit so they can get a single leg or that. So what they're doing is they're constantly probing and feeling for openings. But if you're looking at it at the outside, it just looks like two people in a collar and elbow tie up, upper body hold for hours at a time. It's boring as all get out. After about 2 hours, Jenkins secures a half Nelson, but both men were near the corner of the wall. And Jenkins worked to turn Beell, but Beell was up against the wall, and Jenkins couldn't turn him, and Beell was able to reverse him, and the reversal threw Jenkins' balance off for a second. And Beell grabbed Jenkins with a head and arm chancery and tossed him for the first fall. Jenkins looked absolutely perplexed after that had occurred. Now, if they were working the match, that would have been good theater. Again, if you're going to work this kind of a match, you'd be trying to draw a crowd. You're not going to be wrestling in front of 100 guys. This fall, though, seemed to wake Jenkins up, and actually I think it really made him mad. Because I don't think he thought Beell was good enough to throw him at all. And the fact that he was able to score kind of a fluky fall, but he scored it, I think infuriated him. So as soon as they come back for the second fall after the 10-minute intermission, Jenkins grabs Beell and tosses him as hard as he can against the wall on a throw, and Beell slides down the wall head first, lands on his head. Jenkins grabs him, flips him over, pins him. This was not a foul. There was nothing in the rules that said if you had a setup like this, you could not throw the person, and if they hit the wall, they hit the wall. You know, if Beell didn't want to hit the wall, he should have prevented Jenkins from picking him up and throwing him, which I'm sure he would have if he could have. Jenkins scored that second fall in 1 minute, 13 seconds. Beell is obviously concussed from this throw. He can barely stand. He's staggering around. There's no doctor. There's no ringside physician because this is in a private gymnasium. It's a workout. Well, it's not a workout, but it's in a private gymnasium away from the public. There's no one sanctioning this thing. But Beell refuses to withdraw, even though he's obviously concussed. Jenkins may be feeling bad about what he did. Jenkins comes out, picks up Beell, kind of sets him on the mat, grabs a half Nelson, and turns him for the pin in a minute. Jenkins stands up, shakes Beell's hand, and seems to have more respect for him. This is really Jenkins' last successful title defense. He would meet Frank Gotch a couple months later, and Gotch would win the American title back from Jenkins for the second or third time. Jenkins and Gotch. Jenkins is Gotch's most successful opponent. Jenkins and Gotch wrestled 6 times in competitive matches. They actually wrestled 8 times, and Gotch beat him 5 of the 8 times. But in their competitive matches, so in 1905, after he lost the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship, Jenkins goes into semi-retirement because he's hired by West Point to be the self-defense instructor for the military academy. And this is a position he would hold for, I don't know, 10, 20 years. After he accepts that position at West Point, he is now only a part-time wrestler. And he wrestles Gotch 2 more times, I think in the summer, when the cadets at the military academy would be off doing their service commitment in the summer. He took 2 more matches with Gotch, which Gotch won both of them, but Jenkins was a shell of himself. In their 6 competitive matches before he retired, went to teach at the military academy, they were 3-3. So no other opponent ever beat Gotch twice, much less 3 times. But Tom Jenkins managed to do that. So he is definitely Gotch's toughest opponent. That is the history topic, but we're still going to stay with history because I'm going to go into talking about the movie Iron Claw, and I've got a couple recommendations after this so if you're more interested in world-class championship wrestling, you can check it out. When Wrestling at the Chase went away in 1983, Vince McMahon comes into St. Louis, makes KPLR Channel 11, which had been the home of Wrestling at the Chase, an offer for that time slot, and they get it. And Larry Matysik helped facilitate that because he was on the outs with the people that had taken over the St. Louis Wrestling Club after Sam Muchnick had retired. Larry actually ran his own promotion for like a year, which was, for a time, better than the regular St. Louis promotion. But Bob Geigel, through his contacts in the NWA and the fact that Vern Gagne was a partner in St. Louis, he started bringing in talent from the AWA and World Class Championship Wrestling, which was a part of the National Wrestling Alliance. And they populated the majority of his cards. When we got World Class Championship Wrestling show in, I believe it was late 82, definitely we had it in 1983. And I think we had the World Class show before Vince got Wrestling at the Chase, because World Class came on Channel 30 at 10 o'clock on Sunday, and Wrestling at the Chase came on at 11 o'clock. And I think for a few months we had those, and I was in seventh heaven because I had my 2 favorite shows on back to back. That soon went by the wayside when the WWE came in, and I was pissed the first time that I saw the WWE show because I saw it as cartoon wrestling. I did not like it. My sister hated it. My sister Vicky, who was 15 years older than me, is the one who took me to the wrestling matches when I was a kid and really got me interested in wrestling history. She was a wrestling fan, but no one else in the family would go to the wrestling matches with her. There's 8 of us. I have 7 sisters. I'm the only boy. Vicky asked me would I go with her, and I was happy to. So every 3 weeks on Friday, we would go down and we would see the matches at Kiel Auditorium. Twice a year, Sam would have a big card at the Checker Dome, which was also known as the Arena. When Ralston Purina owned the Blues and the Arena, it was called the Checker Dome. Vicky and I saw Sam Muchnick's retirement show on January 1st, 1982 at the Checker Dome. Vicky also loved World Class. So when we lost Wrestling at the Chase, we were still happy because we still had World Class. My younger sisters, Sherry and Becky, who were 3 and 6 years younger than me, also started watching World Class Championship Wrestling, and they became wrestling fans as well. So there was 4 of us in the family that liked wrestling and watched it. Me, Sherry, and Beck talked our dad into taking us to the Checker Dome for a big show. In like 82 or 83, it was one Vicky couldn't go to, and we talked Dad into taking us. So we all loved World Class Championship Wrestling, and one of the draws on World Class was the Von Erich family. So when we started watching, there were three brothers in wrestling, and they were also huge stars in St. Louis. So we saw Kevin and David Von Erich early on in their wrestling careers. Harley Race was really impressed with David Von Erich in Dallas, and he brought him to St. Louis and actually put David over him straight with an iron claw. And it was either 1978 or 1979. And David was 20 or 21 when Harley bladed to the iron claw and put David over clean in St. Louis in a non-title TV match. Harley really believed in David Von Erich, and so we got to see the Von Erichs early on. And when we started watching, the three Von Erich brothers that were wrestling were Kevin, David, and Kerry. Later on, Mike came into professional wrestling. And Mike always struggled to live up to his brothers because he was smaller. He wasn't nearly as athletic. He didn't really seem to love the business. I never saw Chris. So Chris was the youngest brother. I never saw him in the ring. I saw him in the ring as a little kid out there with his brothers. He was actually the same age as me. But I never saw him wrestle because he wrestled around 90 or 91 and got hurt and everything. By that time, World Class was off the TV in St. Louis. So let's talk about the film itself. Iron Claw is based, and we do want to say based in all caps, on the story of the Von Erich family. There's lots of historical inaccuracies, but I just want to kind of give a brief overview of the film, and then we'll get into some of the ways that this was really historically inaccurate. The person that plays Fritz Von Erich, Holt McElhaney, was outstanding. He captured Fritz's movements and captured the way Fritz was in the ring. He might have the most impressive performance in this film. But the film opens in Buffalo, New York in 1959 with Fritz wrestling an opponent. And the film starts out really well because Fritz is a heel, and Buffalo is where Jack Atkinson became Fritz Von Erich. And promoters started noticing him, and he started developing a national reputation. And in the film, at this point in time, Kevin and David are alive, and Doris, Fritz's wife, is pregnant with Carrie. So that's all accurate. Fritz is convinced he's got the formula or Jack Atkinson is convinced he's got the formula for becoming a big star by becoming Fritz Von Erich, which he was right. He does become a huge star in the 60s and 70s. Then we jump from 1959 to 1976. And Kevin is played by Zac Efron, who I must say did an outstanding job in this film, portraying the complexities of being a son of this strong-willed, hard-headed promoter who wants to make all of his sons wrestling champions. The timeline this is the first place where the timeline is a little inaccurate. So Kevin was the first one to start wrestling, and he started in 1976. But he was only wrestling part-time. He was in and out because he was still playing college football. David only did 1 year of college and gave it up for the wrestling. He was going to do what Kevin did, but when David started in 1977, he liked it so much, David stayed. And David is the one that everybody said had the great mind for wrestling. And David was definitely the best promo, and he was also the best in the ring. That's one of the inaccuracies in the film is David actually had more experience than Kevin, even though Kevin started a year before him. In the film, David's debuting in 1979, which is definitely not correct. I didn't pick up on it at the time, but I thought the movie did a great job of showing how Kevin struggled to deliver promos. Kevin and Kerry were actually terrible promos. And had Mike not come along, they would have probably been the worst promos in the family. But Mike was not a good promo either. David was the only one who was good on the microphone. And there were times you could see where Kevin was getting a little lost, not in the movie, but in real life. And David would kind of step in and save it. And unlike the movie, that never created tension between David and Kevin. David and Kevin were always close and always supported each other. One of the things I thought the film did a fantastic job of doing was portraying the relationship between Kevin and Pam, who is his girlfriend and then becomes his wife. Almost everyone says the reason Kevin is the one Von Erich who survived was because of Pam. That the kids, her kids, Carrie's kids, all say that Uncle Kevin and Aunt Pam's house was so peaceful and they love staying over there, and they all attribute Kevin being the one to survive due to Pam. And Pam knew the family because she went to Graydon High School with Kerry Von Erich and his close friend Brian Adidas, who would also get in, or Brian Adias, who would also get into professional wrestling. I'm going to save one or two of the really negative things that I didn't like about the film. Let me just say, this is a hard film to make because no one looks like those wrestlers from the 1980s. The guy playing Bruiser Brody was pretty good, except he's about 6 inches too short. And it's very hard to get people that look like that. Kerry was smaller than Kevin in this film. And Kerry was a 260-pound Greek god. You know, his physique was the best thing about him. Kevin was a great athlete and had a great physique too, but he was 235 pounds and much smaller than Kerry. And probably the thing I disliked the most was the actor playing Harley Race is not nearly scary enough. He looks like somebody that if he said he was going to come after you, you'd be like, yeah, whatever. Harley, you did not want mad at you. And there was absolutely no rivalry between Kevin and David for the world championship. And David did not usurp Kevin. Kevin has said multiple times Dave was ahead of him as a wrestler because he had much more experience because he stuck with it. And everybody knew David had the best mind. So many people have said this. And I was listening to Bill Mercer the other day, who just passed, and they put up a 2.5 hour interview with him. And he supports most of what I've heard in the past about the situation in world class. And one of the things that he emphasized was David had the best mind for wrestling. He was the most about business. Had he lived, the promotion might have survived if Fritz would have ever listened to him. But that he never saw David using drugs. He said it was possible that David did because almost all of the wrestlers did back then. But he said he never saw David use drugs and he didn't think David was a big user of drugs. He thought Kevin dabbled a little bit, but not that much. But that Kerry, Mike, Chris, Gino Hernandez, Chris Adams were all very heavily involved in that, and they would be messed up all the time. Another thing I put in here, see, I guess my biggest problem with this whole thing is the timeline. The film portrays Fritz as the mean dad who forced all of his kids into professional wrestling and played them off against each other to have this rivalry. There are some elements of truth in that portrayal of Fritz. And it is that pressure on the kids which causes so many of them to die early. We have to correct some of the inaccuracies, though, because I think that it's Bill Mercer pretty much supports the official version of Fritz forcing some of the kids in. Ted DiBiase said he forced them all in. I think the one thing that comes clear through in the interviews I've seen, this movie captures it. Fritz controlled his sons in an unnatural way for a father to be controlling adults. He should not have had the amount of control over his adult sons that he did. I think with David, he didn't have as much control as he probably would have liked, but it seems with all the rest, he did have quite a bit of control. And he definitely, 100%, without question, forced Mike into the ring. Mike did not want to be a wrestler. Mike wanted to be a cameraman. Mike did not have any interest in being a professional wrestler, and he was small, and he looked like David, and he knew he could not live up to that legacy. Yet Fritz forced him into the ring. There's probably some truth that he forced Kevin as well. Kevin wrestled part-time, but Kevin wanted to be a football player, and other wrestlers asked Kevin, "So you always wanted to be a wrestler like your dad?" And he said, "No, not really. I wanted to play football." I do not believe he forced David or Kerry into wrestling. He might have pushed them to get into it too soon or pushed them to be bigger stars before they were ready. But I don't think he forced either David or Kerry. They both seemed to like wrestling, want to be professional wrestlers. They were also willing to travel and go other places, where Kevin pretty much wanted to stay in Dallas. He didn't really have any interest going outside of world class. And the one person that Fritz absolutely did not force into professional wrestling, Chris wanted to be a professional wrestler more than anything on this earth, and he was too small, and that's what led to his taking his own life at only 21 years of age. He had asthma, and the medicine he took made his bones brittle, and he was just very small. He was like 5'5". He got up to 175 pounds, but he was just too small. But there is nothing he wanted more in the world than to be a professional wrestler, because he idolized Kerry and he wanted to be like his big brother. He probably forced two of the boys, but Fritz was still trying to control his sons for their entire careers. He had a booking contract with his sons that he got a booking fee every time they went somewhere else and wrestled. And Kevin had been invited to be filmed in Israel. He and Bill Mercer were going to go over. They weren't even going to be doing anything like wrestling or that. They were just going to be filmed. And it ended up getting canceled. Kevin was set to make about $75,000, and Bill Mercer was going to make about $25,000. So they were willing to pay Kevin and Bill Mercer $100,000 to come over to Israel just for an appearance, basically, that they were going to film. And Fritz said, "You can't go unless they give me $25,000 or $30,000 because of this booking contract." I cannot imagine taking an opportunity like that away from Trey or Caleb. If I had the money Fritz Von Erich did, he didn't need the money. He had a very successful promotion. Yet, even though he's a successful promoter, he's trying to take money from his son who's not even doing a wrestling appearance, really. I find that personally disgusting. I cannot imagine taking an opportunity away from one of my kids and saying, "No, they got to pay me the booking fee or you can't go." Absolutely ridiculous. The problem is Fritz is probably not very unique. I mean, doing it to his kids is probably unique. Well, no, I can't say that, because I know that Roy Welch wasn't always. He took a promotion from his son that his son had built. Buddy Fuller just took the promotion out from underneath him. And Ron Fuller has talked about his dad and Jim Barnett trying to rip him off of a certain amount of money. And that's one of the problems when you're researching professional wrestling. A lot of times it's hard to find good guys to be rooting for, particularly in the promotional ranks. I was thinking the other day, who could I say was a honorable promoter? And the only one I could think of was Sam Muchnick. He's the only one. And even Sam, I mean, Sam was involved in blackballing people, and that as the president of the NWA. but as a person of personal moral fiber and character, he is one of the few that wasn't a double-dealing backstabber. That's why all the wrestlers loved working for him, because he was so honest and scrupulous in his payoffs. So Fritz is not unique in that. I've got so many inaccuracies here. Let me finish my synopsis of the film, and then I'm going to get back to all the inaccuracies in the film. The first death they record in this film, the first is, of course, David. David's death is the thing that started the demise of world-class championship wrestling. People that think David was not going to be the world champion are talking through their hat. He was endorsed by Harley Race as a future world champion in 1977 when he was only 19 years old after wrestling a match with Harley in Fort Worth, Texas. And that's one of the matches I'm going to recommend for this week. There'll be links in the show notes at kenzermanjr.com/episode 84. Had David lived, the main event at the Parade of Champions in Dallas in June of 1984 would have been David Von Erich versus Ric Flair. David would have won the title, and David would have held the title until Starrcade 84. He'd have been a heel champion some places, a fan favorite other places, but David went to Florida to prepare him for that, and Dory Funk Jr. was one of the people helping prepare him. They had their eyes on David as a world champion for a long time. He would have went into Starrcade as the heel champion, and he would have lost to Rick. He would have held the title from June of 84 to November of 84. However, David dies in Japan in February. What do I think happened? Because there's been talk about drug overdoses, all kinds of other things. I think what happened. He had got kicked in a wrestling match. It had bruised into his intestines, but he was under so much pressure because he knew what was coming up, and he didn't want to do anything to make the NWA think twice about making him the world champion. And what is the number one thing you have to be as the NWA world champion? You have to be reliable. You have to be able to get to where you're supposed to be and wrestle who you're supposed to wrestle, that these promoters have been building up for weeks to months, because if you no-show, that screws up months worth of booking for that local promoter. So David, knowing he had these commitments in Japan, instead of putting it off, or he wanted to prove, no matter what happens, I'll be there, I'm going to be dependable. He flew over to Japan with that injury. It got worse, and his intestine ruptured in the middle of the night, and he died. Several of the wrestlers had said, had he ruptured in the arena or somewhere else, he probably would have lived. But he ruptured in the middle of the night and he died. That sets off Fritz using David's passing to get the NWA to okay Kerry as the world champion. And that was probably not an easy argument, because what have we said that the NWA world champion has to be? Dependable. Kerry was not dependable. Kerry had a very, very bad drug habit. And as was proven, Kerry wins the title at the Parade of Champions. He's actually supposed to hold it for a few months. He's not going to go to Starrcade against Flair. Flair's going to get it back before then. But Kerry was supposed to hold it for a couple of months. Ric Flair and Harley Race went to Hawaii on vacation because Rick thought he was not going to be the world champion for a couple of months. And Jim Crockett called him and said, hey, you need to fly to Japan right now. We need to take the title off of Kerry. Because in the first 10 days or so that Kerry was world champion for 18 days. In the first 10 days he was world champion, he missed 2 dates. So they took the belt off him. And that ticked Fritz off, of course, but, that's what happens when people are undependable. In the movie, Kerry wins the title. He goes out and has the accident which took his foot that night. as he's sitting there looking at the NWA World Championship. So again, based on a true story that he was in that accident and lost his foot 2 years later. The next is, Mike being forced into the ring. Mike injures himself, gets the toxic shock, and his mind is never the same after that. And Bill Mercer said the doctor who treated him was a good friend of Bill Mercer's, and he told him he's not going to be the same. When he had that 107, 108-degree fever, he goes, it's going to fry some of the wiring in his brain. He's never going to be cognitively what he was before this all happened to him. Yet Fritz pushed him back into the ring. Mike kills himself. Then Kerry, the big star who's missing a foot, forces himself to get back into the ring. And that was a long recovery. I had forgotten how long that was. That was almost a year and a half it took Kerry to recover and get back in the ring. And they had actually saved his foot initially, but Kerry got up in the middle of the night and started walking around, and you're not supposed to put any load bearing on a foot injury like that for, weeks to months, and it crushed the bones that they had just repaired, and that's why he lost his foot. Kerry eventually, being the big star and that in the WWE, they quit using him. Kerry got arrested. He was facing jail for steroid and recreational drug possession, and this time he was going to go to prison. He had been arrested a few times before that, and he was on probation. So now that he'd been arrested again, this time he was going to go to jail and do some jail time. And in the film, Kerry goes on his dad's ranch and kills himself, which is what happened. But the filmmakers combined Chris's death and Kerry's death because Kevin did not find Kerry. Fritz found Kerry. Kerry was staying at Fritz's because Fritz had just divorced Doris, and Kerry had just divorced, had gone through a divorce with his wife. They had tried to have a reconciliation, but it didn't work. So Kerry was staying with Fritz, and he went out, took the new gun he had bought Fritz, and he did kill himself. And Fritz was the one that found him. Kevin and Doris found Chris. So Chris was home. He had Kevin had come upon him, didn't have a gun on him or anything. He had a gun on him, but Kevin couldn't see it. And Kevin's like, "Why are you up here?" Because he was kind of in a secluded spot. He goes, "I'm just thinking, just leave me be." And so Kevin goes back to the house, and when he goes back to the house, his mom had just found the suicide note. Kevin and Doris run back out and jump in the truck and fly up to where Kevin had just seen Chris. He yells Chris because Chris was laying at the base of this tree. And then when Kevin said at first he didn't see the bullet wound, and when he moved Chris, then he felt the blood from the back of his head on his hand, and he saw the bullet wound in Chris's head. And Doris was with him, and Kevin said he couldn't shield her from that. She saw what happened. And that's when Bill Mercer had said Doris divorced Fritz after Mike's death, but I'm almost 100% positive she divorced him after Chris's death. But their relationship was strained from Mike's suicide on because she blamed Fritz for forcing Mike into the ring. And of course, Chris couldn't be a wrestler. In the film, Kevin finds Kerry. Kevin chokes his dad because he blames his dad for Kerry's death. And Doris and Fritz are still together because Doris is just kind of staring off into space. So I couldn't help but cover a bunch of the mistakes in the film. It does leave you with a little hope, the film does, because it ends with Kevin and Pam and their kids, and you see the difference in the way Kevin interacts with his sons than the way Fritz interacted with his sons.
So it does leave you with a hopeful message, even though it's a very, very tragic film. I do recommend the film. It may seem like I don't because of all the historical inaccuracies, but I actually do recommend the film. I think it is a good film, and I think the Von Erich story is a very interesting story. But I did want to finish a few of my thoughts, and then I'm going to make a couple of recommendations. I hated the actor playing Ric Flair. The only two that I really thought were horrible was the person playing Harley Race because he's not nearly scary enough, and the person playing Ric Flair was playing a caricature of Ric Flair. Did not like that either. But one of the things is Fritz is watching supposedly in 1981 Flair win the title for the first time over Harley Race, and it's obvious when you look at the footage. It is Starrcade '83 where Flair took the title back from Harley. Then 1981, Dusty Rhodes beat Harley, and then 2 months later, Flair beat Dusty in Kansas City during September 1981. Flair was the champion from 1981 till early 1983, I think June. I think Harley beat Rick in June of '83 to set up the match in Charlotte on Thanksgiving night where Flair would take the title back from Harley. And that was the very first Starrcade. Kerry started wrestling in 1980. They had that right after Jimmy Carter boycotted the Olympics because Kerry was going to be a discus thrower in that Olympics. Some other inaccuracies. So Kevin and Pam married in 1980, not 1983, and not right before Dave went to Japan. Kevin, David, and Kerry were all married at the time of David's death. The last person to see David before he died was Wild Bill Irwin. They were up in his room, and David said, "Hey, I'm going to call Trish, who was his wife, and then I'm going to go to sleep." And that was the last words that uh, Wild Bill ever heard him say. The Von Erichs called it world class or Dallas, Texas, not WCCW. WCCW became a thing in 1986. They also have a very dramatic thing where Fritz in, I don't know, 83, 80, I think it was 83, maybe 84, calls out Sam Muchnick. Actually, that interview was September of '83, where Fritz gave the interview at Star Wars. But he never called out Sam Muchnick. Sam Muchnick retired January 1st, 1982, long before any of those things happened. And he'd not been the NWA president since 1975. Fritz had been the NWA president in between 1975 and when all this is going on. So that was ridiculous. He never called out Sam. There was no coin flip between Kevin and Kerry to decide who was going to be the world champion. The other NWA promoters had to agree. There was no way they were going to agree to Kevin because he was wanting to homestead. They would have still had problems with Kerry because of the dependability. But if the NWA promoters were going to put the title on anybody, they were going to put it on Kerry. They were not going to let Fritz flip a coin between his sons to decide who was going to be the world champion. Kerry was injured in 1986, not after winning the title. And Kerry's injury pretty much put the nail in the coffin. So David dying started the decline of world-class championship wrestling. Kerry's injury sped that up because their biggest star was now out, and he was out for a year and a half. And Fritz tried his best to replace Kerry, but he never was able to. Mike debuted in late 1983. He debuted before David died. Mike was definitely the one that Fritz forced into the ring more than any of the other sons. And Mike also committed suicide in a nearby park, not on the Von Erich property. Ric Flair did not come to Dallas after Mike's death because World Class left the NWA in February 1986, and the World Class Champion. That's when it became. It was always World Class Championship Wrestling, the television show, but the promotion was always called World Class. It was in 1986 that WCCW became a thing, and they had their own world champion. And the whole thing for creating the WCCW champion was that was going to be Kerry, and he might lose it occasionally, but that was going to be Kerry's title. But unfortunately for Fritz, Kerry gets hurt, and just a few months after they left the NWA, so now he is switching that title between a bunch of people. Kevin would hold it, Rick Rude would hold it, Black Bart would hold it. So a lot of people say that Fritz made a big mistake in leaving the NWA. Mike died in April 1987. Kevin did not shoot on Ric Flair with the Iron Claw after Mike's death. As we said, Ric Flair didn't come back to Dallas after early 1986. And part of the reason for that was Jim Crockett was the president of the NWA. He was also Ric Flair's main promoter in the Carolinas. And he told Fritz, I think because Rick was tired of wrestling Kerry when he was under the influence, that Rick was not coming back to Dallas anytime soon. So Fritz got mad and left the NWA. We've already talked about Chris being completely left out of the uh, film. And then Doris leaving Fritz after Chris's suicide, so she wasn't there when Kerry committed suicide. And Fritz is definitely the bad guy of the film, and it's probably a pretty accurate portrayal. I'm sure that he loved his sons, but he also treated his sons like they were a commodity for his business. And there were times he should have been worried about being a father and less worried about being the promoter of World Class. If you want a more accurate account of the Von Erich story, watch The Triumph and Tragedy of World Class Championship Wrestling on the WWE Network or Peacock. WWE is putting up so much old stuff through their YouTube channel, WWE Vault. There's a good chance if you put Triumph and Tragedy of World Class Championship Wrestling, they may have it up on YouTube, because it doesn't seem like WWE values their territorial material that much anymore. And let's face it, probably a lot of people that like that are dying out, so you might even be able to find it up on YouTube. And these are both on YouTube. The links will be in the show notes at kenzermanjr.com/episode 84. So there were two matches I want to recommend based on the Iron Claw movie and the Triumph and Tragedy of World Class Championship Wrestling. The first is that match I talked about of Harley Race versus David Von Erich from Fort Worth, Texas in 1977. It is on YouTube. And that match is the first time Harley endorses David Von Erich. After they wrestled that match, they interviewed Harley, and Harley said this kid is going to be the NWA World Heavyweight Champion one day, which was a huge endorsement to get that from Harley. The other match is a match from May 8th. Well, the show is available, the full show. You just put in WCCW May 8th, 1982. We've actually reviewed this match already before on the podcast because I had Trey watch it. Been a martial artist since he was 4 years old, and he got a kick out of it as well. So they are working this match. It is the main event match for the show, is the match I'm recommending, and it is a match between Kevin Von Erich and the Great Kabuki. And everybody always talks about how stiff Kevin is in the ring, and you can see with this show, Kevin is very stiff in the ring. And you could tell Kabuki got tired of it, because at about the 33-minute mark of this show, Kevin had go back to about 32:30. Kevin does a drop kick on Kabuki and stiffed the heck out of him. one foot just hits Kabuki straight in the face. And you could tell Kabuki had gotten tired of it because Kevin whips him into the ropes, and Kevin comes running in, and Kabuki hits him with the stiffest sidekick I've seen in a wrestling match. I've thrown many a sidekick in my day, and I didn't pull it. And Kabuki didn't pull this one either. Kevin hits the mat and immediately grabs his jaw to check if his jaw is broken. That's how hard Kabuki hit him. And after the match, Kevin has got a black eye and a bloody nose because he and Kabuki really went at it in this match. Give Kevin credit. He never quits. He didn't complain. After the match, he said, "Oh, it didn't hurt a bit." And they said that's how Kevin was, that if you were stiff with him, he didn't mind. You could have a stiff match with him, and he never, ever complained, even though he was the boss's son. But you could tell Kabuki's had enough, and he gives as good as he gets in this match. That's also probably one of the reasons I liked World Class so much when I was a kid, is because you couldn't see through it, because sometimes they were throwing potatoes at each other. Well, we're almost at an hour, so I think that's enough for this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. As I said earlier, KenZimmermanJr.com is the place to check out the show notes for today's episode. It's also the place to check out all of my previous work, anything that you might be interested in, and my Amazon authors page link is on that website as well if you want to check out the books I've written. Thank you for listening today. I would also be grateful if you would rate this podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. That helps tremendously with keeping the podcast visible so people who have never heard of it can discover it. If you've already done this, thank you so much. I would also like to send a special thank you out to the YouTube subscribers. It's continuing to grow each week, and I really appreciate the loyalty. If you would like to comment on this episode or ask a question, please go to KenZimmermanJr.com. Find the contact page at the top navigation and drop me an email. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.